Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today we will hear the story of The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. St. Ogg's is a made-up town with the fictional Floss River running through it. Mr. Jeremy Tulliver owns Dorlcote Mill, which is set on the Ripple, a small stream that flows into the Floss. The Floss powers the mill, which grinds grain into flour, and that's how the Tulliver family makes their living. Mr. Tulliver lives there with his wife Bessie, their lively 9-year-old daughter Maggie, and their son Tom, who is nearly 13. It's a February afternoon. Mr. and Mrs. Tulliver are sitting by the fire talking about their son Tom's future. Mr. Tulliver wants Tom to get a good education so he can have a successful job like an engineer or surveyor instead of being a miller like him. Mrs. Tulliver wants to ask her sisters for their input on the matter, but Mr. Tulliver thinks it is a bad idea. Mrs. Tulliver wants Tom to stay close so she can take care of him, but her husband decides to ask his friend Riley for help in finding the right school for Tom. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tulliver is concerned about their daughter Maggie. She thinks Maggie is too messy and doesn't behave as nicely as her cousin Lucy. Maggie's free spirit frustrates her mother, but Mr. Tulliver finds it more amusing and he isn't as worried about it. Mr. Riley, an auctioneer, talks about a well-respected clergyman, Mr. Stelling, who went to Oxford and is taking in a few students. Mr. Tulliver likes the idea, but Mrs. Tulliver is worried about Tom being too far from home. Riley assures them that Stelling is qualified and doesn't charge too much. He also offers to contact Mr. Stelling for them to see if Tom can be accepted. Maggie is upset because she isn't allowed to go with her father to pick up Tom from school due to the rainy weather, which would ruin her bonnet. In frustration, she dunks her head in a basin of water to ruin her mother's efforts to curl her hair. Her mother scolds her, but Maggie runs off to the attic, her favorite place when she is upset. There, she vents her anger by hitting a broken doll she keeps for such moments. As her mood begins to improve, she notices the sun shining and feels cheerful again. She plays with Yap, the family dog. She is excited that Tom is coming home. She joins Luke, the head miller, in the mill and learns from him that Tom's rabbits have died. Maggie feels terrible, realizing she has forgotten to take care of them. She fears Tom will be angry. Tom arrives and is greeted with kisses from his mother and a big hug from Maggie. But he is already thinking about the fields and his plans to go fishing. Once inside, Tom tells Maggie that he has a surprise for her. 2 new fishing lines, one just for her. He explains that he saved his money at school by not buying treats and even had some fights with other boys to get the lines. Maggie is happy and thankful for the gift. Soon after, Tom finds out his rabbits have died because they weren't fed. He gets angry and blames Maggie, telling her he doesn't love her anymore. Maggie is heartbroken and runs to the attic to cry, feeling awful that Tom is mad at her. After a while, Tom goes to find her. When he calls her down, Maggie runs to him, begging for forgiveness. Tom softens and gives her a piece of cake. They make up. The next day, they happily go fishing together. It's Easter week and Mrs. Tulliver makes delicious cheesecakes. is the perfect time for a family gathering and she is hosting a big one. She plans to talk to her sisters, Glegg and Pullet, about sending Tom to school, but Mrs. Tulliver hesitates to invite her sister Diane because she worries Diane might criticize her children. Mrs. Tulliver, formerly a Dodson, follows the Dodson family's strict standards in everything, from cooking to funerals. Tom and Maggie, excited by the smell of cakes and food, sneak into the kitchen and steal some jam puffs. Later, Tom leaves to meet his mischievous friend Bob Jakin. They go on an adventure to catch rats, but end up fighting over a game of heads or tails. After the fight, Tom decides he doesn't want to be friends with Bob anymore. The sisters show up: Mrs. Pullet, Mrs. Glegg, and Mrs. Diane. Mr. Pullet is a farmer, Mr. Glegg is retired, and Mr. Diane works as a manager at the well-known company Guest & Co. Out of the three, Mr. Diane is now the richest. Mrs. Glegg arrives first and refuses the cheesecake because she doesn't believe in eating between meals. She starts complaining about everything, from the late dinner to how Mrs. Tulliver manages her house. Mrs. Tulliver, used to her scolding, doesn't mind much. Then Mrs. Pullet walks in, crying. Mrs. Glegg scorns her when she realizes her sister is upset over someone who wasn't even related to them. Mrs. Diane comes with her daughter Lucy. When Maggie and Tom arrive, Mrs. Diane criticizes Maggie's appearance, especially her wild hair, comparing it to Lucy's. Mrs. Tulliver asks Maggie to have the servant fix her hair, but instead, Maggie impulsively cuts it all off. When the family sees a new haircut, they are all upset. The only one who comforts her is her father. Tulliver says it's fine to cut her hair if it bothered her. Later on, the topic shifts to Tom's future. Mrs. Glegg argues that sending him to school is pointless if the Tullivers don't have money. This offends Mr. Tulliver, and they end up in an argument. Mrs. Glegg reminds Tulliver that he owes her money, and Mr. Tulliver tells her to mind her own business. Mrs. Glegg storms out, with her husband following her. Tulliver owes £500 to Mrs. Glegg. Mrs. Tulliver is worried because Tulliver argued with her. She might ask for the money back. This could make things hard for them. Tulliver ignores his wife's worry and says he will pay the money. The next day, Tulliver goes to visit his sister Gritty and her husband Mr. Moss. They live in a poor village called Bassett. Mr. Moss is a poor farmer and they have 8 children. At first, Tulliver starts with a harsh business-like attitude, but then he softens because he loves his sister. Gritty talks about how much she loves Maggie and hopes Tom will always care for his sister, just as Mr. Tulliver has always cared for her. Tulliver had actually gone there to get the money that he had given to them, but instead of getting it back from them, he feels sorry for Gritty and tells her not to worry about the loan. He thinks of Maggie and hopes to set a good example for Tom to be kind to his sister. Mrs. Tulliver takes Tom, Maggie and Lucy to visit their aunt and uncle at Caram Firs, the Pullets' farm. While there, Mrs. Pullet shows off a fancy new bonnet she bought. The children spend time building card houses, but Maggie is upset because Tom has been favoring Lucy all day. Earlier, she had accidentally knocked over Tom's card house, which made things worse. She accidentally ruins a cake, and her aunt and uncle scold her, making her feel even worse. But when her uncle plays a tune on his musical snuff box, it cheers her up for a moment. When the children are sent outside to play, Mrs. Tulliver talks to Mrs. Pullet about the argument between Mr. Tulliver and Mrs. Glegg. Both are too proud to apologize. Mrs. Tulliver asks Mrs. Poulett to help, and she agrees to visit Mrs. Glegg and convince her not to demand repayment of the loan. While playing outside, Tom invites Lucy to see a toad, leaving Maggie feeling left out. She follows them as Tom takes Lucy to the pond. When they reach the pond, Tom tells Maggie to go away. Out of jealousy, Maggie pushes Lucy into the mud. Tom helps Lucy and scolds Maggie. Lucy is brought inside, muddy and upset. Both Aunt Poulett and Mrs. Tulliver are shocked. Aunt Poulett blames Mrs. Tulliver's kids for causing trouble, while Mrs. Tulliver feels ashamed and goes to find Maggie. When she realizes Maggie has run away, she decides to rush home to look for her. Maggie runs away from the Pouletts, planning to join the gypsies and escape her problems. She imagines living with them in a tent, but when she finally finds their camp, she feels a bit let down. The gypsies welcome her, and she tries to impress them by talking about books and offering to teach them. Soon, though, she realizes they care more about her belongings than her stories. They offer her food, but it tastes strange to her, and she starts feeling uncomfortable. A gypsy man takes her back to St. Ogg's on his donkey. While they are on the way, Maggie spots her father riding toward her and cries out for him. Surprised, her father picks her up and takes her home, relieved to have found her. Maggie promises never to run away again. When they get home, no one scolds her. St. Ogg's is an old town with red roofs and big warehouses where ships bring goods from the north and trade for local products like cheese and wool. The town's history goes back to the Roman times, with stories of Saxon kings and Viking invaders. It also has a Norman-built hall and an even older church. According to legend, St. Ogg, the town's patron saint, was a boatman who helped a poor woman cross the river during a storm. She turned into a glowing figure and blessed him, ensuring that no one would ever be in danger on his boat. Even after his death, people say Ogg still appears during floods to save them. This is where Mrs. and Mr. Glegg live. Mr. Glegg, a retired wool merchant, now spends his time gardening. He is kind and doesn't like it when his wife is upset with others. He convinces her not to pull her money from Mr. Tulliver right away, suggesting it's better to wait for a smarter investment. The next day, Mrs. Poulett tries to smooth things over between Mrs. Glegg and Mr. Tulliver. Mrs. Glegg agrees not to hold a grudge and says she'll be polite if Tulliver is. Mrs. Poulett, feeling relieved, moves on to complaining about Bessie's children. Later that day, Mrs. Glegg gets a letter from Mr. Tulliver saying she'll get her £500 back soon. He also makes it clear he doesn't need any help from her. This letter frustrates Mrs. Glegg and makes the situation worse. Mrs. Tulliver unknowingly caused this by telling Mr. Tulliver that Mrs. Poulett was trying to fix things which annoyed him and led him to write the letter. Mrs. Glegg doesn't visit the Tullivers again until just before Tom leaves for school in August. Meanwhile, Mr. Tulliver realizes he has to borrow money to repay Mrs. Glegg, and to his frustration, he has to borrow it from a client of his old rival, Wakeham. When Tom starts school at King's Lorton with Reverend Walter Stelling, he struggles to adjust. At his old school, he was good at games and felt confident, but here, Latin and geometry are much harder for him. Mr. Stelling is serious and wants to make a name for himself, so he pushes Tom a lot. Tom's parents are impressed with Stelling and feel good about leaving Tom there. Tom feels lonely and misses home. But things improve when his sister Maggie visits. She is eager to help him with his studies, though she also finds them difficult. They enjoy their time together, but after she leaves, Tom goes back to feeling isolated, counting down the days until the holidays. In the end, he is so relieved when the term finally ends, and just thinking about going back to the mill makes everything seem better. Tom comes back to Dorlcote Mill for the Christmas holidays. However, Mr. Tulliver's bad mood dims the festivities for Tom. Mr. Tulliver is upset because Mr. Pivot, a neighboring farmer, negatively affects the mill's water power with his irrigation plans. Mr. Tulliver suspects that Mr. Pivot's lawyer, Wakeham, put Mr. Pivot up to it. Mr. Tulliver bears a grudge over a suit that Wakeham won against him, costing Tulliver his private right of road and the bridge. He decides to go to law against Wakeham. Tom finds out Wakeham's son will be joining him at Mr. Stelling's, but Mr. Tulliver doesn't mind since he likes the idea of Tom having the same advantages as his enemy's son. Tom goes back to school on a gloomy January day. Mr. Stelling welcomes him and introduces him to a new classmate, Philip Wakeham, who is the son of Mr. Tulliver's enemy. Due to an accident in infancy, Philip's spine is deformed, resulting in his hunchback. Philip is sensitive and intelligent. Tom feels awkward around him at first because of his appearance and Mr. Tulliver's hatred of his father. Tom is impressed by Philip's drawing skills though. Philip knows a lot about Greek heroes and Tom is keen to hear those stories. Feeling intimidated by Philip's knowledge, Tom asks if he wants to go fishing with him, an area where Tom knows he is superior. But Philip says he thinks fishing is a waste of time. Tom feels uneasy about Philip, but enjoys his company when Philip is in a good mood. Philip often gets irritable because he feels that people look at him with pity due to his deformity. Mr. Stelling hires a drill master, Mr. Poulter, for Tom. Tom loves listening to Mr. Poulter's war stories and even convinces him to show off his sword. One day, Tom interrupts Philip, who is playing piano, to come and watch Mr. Poulter's sword demonstration. Philip gets upset by the disturbance. He calls Tom an idiot, and in return, Tom calls Philip's father a scoundrel. Tom is fascinated by the sword, and he bribes old Poulter to let him keep it under his bed. He plans a surprise for Maggie when she comes to see him again. After the argument, Tom and Philip stop talking much. Tom doesn't understand why they can't just move on. Philip, who is sensitive and often feels hurt when people pity his deformity, is more upset than Tom realizes. When Tom's sister Maggie visits, she is curious about Philip because he is the son of a lawyer her dad dislikes. While watching Philip during his lessons, she thinks he is smart and interesting. Maggie feels bad for Philip because his dad isn't nice and she believes people should be kinder to him. Tom takes Maggie upstairs to show her the sword. He dresses up as a warrior with a makeshift turban and the sword. However, the game turns scary for Maggie when Tom points the sword at her. Suddenly, the sword slips and hurts Tom's foot. Tom is worried that he might never walk properly again. When Philip hears about the accident, he feels bad for Tom. He finds out from Mr. Stelling that Tom will recover fully. He rushes to tell Tom, who is relieved and happy to hear that he'll be okay. After that, Philip hangs out a lot with Tom and his sister Maggie, sharing stories and keeping them company. Maggie and Philip grow close, and she tells him she would treat him like her own brother. Philip feels happy because Maggie treats him kindly and doesn't pity him like others. She even offers to kiss him like she does with Tom, which makes Philip feel loved and accepted. However, Tom and Philip's friendship doesn't last. They go back to their old ways of not really trusting or liking each other much. Tom's dad even warns him not to get too close to Philip. He reminds Tom that Philip is different and that their current friendliness shouldn't make them permanent friends. Tom stays in school until he is 16, while Maggie attends a boarding school with her cousin Lucy. Maggie often writes to Tom and asks about their friend Philip, but Tom and Philip's friendship has cooled down. Meanwhile, Mr. Tulliver is caught up in a lawsuit with Wakeham and Mr. Pivot, which makes him very upset whenever he hears Wakeham's name. In November, Maggie visits Tom at school to tell him that their father lost the lawsuit and will lose the mill and all his property. On top of that, their father had a severe accident, falling off his horse and getting so hurt that he now only recognizes Maggie. Shocked by the news, Tom asks Reverend Stelling for permission to leave, and the siblings return home together. What exactly happened back at home? Even after losing the lawsuit to Wakeham, Mr. Tulliver remained hopeful. However, he soon faced a series of setbacks. Mr. Riley passed away, leaving behind a debt of £250 to Mr. Tulliver. Additionally, Mr. Tulliver needed to repay £500 he had borrowed to settle a debt with Mrs. Glegg. He hoped Mr. Furley, the holder of the mortgage on his land, would buy the mill and allow him to continue managing it. He also wanted his wife to get a loan from the Pullets so they wouldn't lose their furniture. Mr. Tulliver sent a letter to his daughter Maggie, who was at boarding school, asking her to return home. He then went to his lawyer, Mr. Gore, to discuss if Mr. Furley was interested in buying the mill. At the lawyer's office, he discovered that Mr. Furley had sold his mortgage to Wakeham, making Wakeham the new owner of all Mr. Tulliver's assets. This news shocked Mr. Tulliver so much that he collapsed and was seriously injured. When Tom learns that Wakeham now controls their mill, he becomes furious. He instructs Maggie to never speak to Philip Wakeham again, blaming the Wakehams for their family's misfortune. When Tom and Maggie arrive home, they find a stranger smoking in their father's chair. Maggie quickly goes upstairs to check on her unresponsive father. In a storeroom, they find Mrs. Tulliver among family treasures she fears will be lost. She is upset, reflecting on the past and blaming Mr. Tulliver for their situation. Tom assures her he will take care of things and plans to find a job. Maggie becomes upset when she hears her mother blaming her father and focusing on their possessions rather than on him. Despite the tensions, Maggie and Tom come together to support each other, setting aside their differences. The aunts and uncles meet to talk about the family's problems. Mrs. Tulliver cleans the parlor, Mrs. Pullet cries, and Mrs. Glegg dresses in her finest clothes. They discuss how to prevent the family's belongings from being auctioned off. Mrs. Tulliver expresses her sadness about potentially losing family heirlooms, especially those marked with her initials. She hopes her siblings will buy them to keep them in the family. Mrs. Glegg points out that the real issue is Mr. Tulliver's bad decisions, and they should focus on practical solutions rather than getting attached to belongings. The conversation shifts to how to financially support the family. Tom suggests that instead of leaving money to him and Maggie in their wills, the aunt should give it to them now to help them save their furniture and the mill. When the aunts refuse, Maggie tells them she doesn't want their money if they won't help their family when they need it the most. Mrs. Moss, Mr. Tulliver's sister, arrives, upset about her brother's situation and unsure how to help without affecting her own family, who are also struggling. Tom explains that he doesn't want to take money from Mrs. Moss because Tom explains that he doesn't want to take money from Mrs. Moss because he knows his father would never want to burden her. Mr. Tulliver is showing signs of paralysis and lies unresponsive in bed. While searching for a document in an old chest, Mr. Glegg and Tom accidentally make a noise. This noise surprisingly wakes Mr. Tulliver. Seeing his family going through his things makes him anxious, but he recognizes them and speaks clearly. He tells Tom to be easy on the Mosses about the loan. However, Mr. Tulliver soon becomes unresponsive again. His doctor says that his temporary recovery is a good sign, but Mr. Tulliver still struggles to remember things that affect his self-esteem. Tom decides to take care of the financial issues and plans to use his and Maggie's savings to repay the small debts if needed. Tom goes to see his uncle Dian for advice on getting a job. He thinks his uncle Dian can help because he is successful and understands business better than his other relatives. His uncle advises that Tom is too young and inexperienced for anything significant right now. He suggests Tom start with basic jobs to learn the business, just like he did. Tom convinces Dian that he will work hard at whatever job Dian might find him. Dian is impressed by this but makes no commitments. Tom feels unsure but motivated to make his way, despite the hard reality of his situation. In December, the Tulliver family's furniture is auctioned off for more than 2 days. The family, including Mrs. Tulliver and the children, stays next to Mr. Tulliver in a quiet room, feeling anxious as they hear the sounds of their belongings being sold. Mrs. Tulliver is especially upset, thinking about her favorite items being auctioned. Eventually, the sale ends and the noise stops. Mrs. Tulliver looks much older because of the stress. Kezia, the family's housemaid, cleans the house, trying to make the parlor comfortable for the family to use that evening. During this tough time, a visitor named Bob Jakin comes to see Tom. Bob, an old friend who now works on a boat, offers Tom 9 sovereigns to help out. Tom is touched by Bob's kindness but refuses the money, wanting to earn his own way. However, Bob insists on leaving 1 sovereign for Tom and Maggie to buy something as a gesture of his goodwill. In December, Mr. Tulliver starts to get better. The Tullivers have to sell their mill and land. Mrs. Tulliver is worried and comes up with a plan. She thinks about talking to Mr. Wakeham, the lawyer who has the mortgage and whom Mr. Tulliver considers an enemy. She secretly meets Mr. Wakeham and asks him not to bid on their house and mill because Guest & Company planned to buy it and keep her husband as the manager. However, Mr. Wakeham is not convinced by her appeal. He decides to buy the mill and house himself and keep Mr. Tulliver as the manager. In January, Mr. Tulliver comes downstairs for the first time since his illness. He doesn't know their things have been sold and the house is empty. His family worries about how he will react. Mr. Tulliver learns that Mr. Wakeham now owns the mill and land and he offers him a job to manage the mill. Most of the family thinks he should take the job, but Tom and Mr. Tulliver feel it would be embarrassing. Feeling defeated and guilty about their money problems, Mr. Tulliver agrees to whatever his wife suggests. Mr. Tulliver struggles with his hatred for Wakeham and his promise to Mrs. Tulliver to make things right. He walks around his property with his servant Luke, and they talk about how they dislike new places and people. Tulliver tells Maggie to bring the family Bible. When Tom arrives, Tulliver calls him in. He promises his family that He will keep his word to Mrs. Tulliver and work for Wakem. But he also promises not to forgive Wakem. He asks Tom to write in the Bible, swearing to remember what Wakem did and to take revenge. Maggie begs Tom not to sign, but Tom agrees to do what his father asks. Mr. Tulliver has recovered enough to work and now manages for Mr. Wakem. He remains deeply depressed and is focused on repaying his debts. He has become very strict and miserly, keeping tight control over the household. Tom continues working at Guest and Company, learning bookkeeping, and gives his salary to the family's savings. Maggie has nothing to occupy her and feels no love from her father or Tom anymore. Instead, she feels sorry for her mother, who has become sad and fragile. Mrs. Tulliver, being hopeless, has started to place her hopes on Maggie. The Dodsons visit less often, as their family ties weaken due to the misfortune. Maggie sits outside, unable to focus on her book. She is distracted by her father's anger the day before, after Wakem's visit. He had beaten a boy from the mill, and before that he had beaten his horse. Maggie worries that one day he might hurt her mother. Bob Jakin arrives and gives Maggie some books he bought for her, remembering how upset she was when the family's books were sold. Maggie is very touched by his kindness. One of the books is Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, which talks about letting go of self-love and focusing on the suffering of others. Maggie feels she has found the secret to face her hard life. She begins reading to her father and takes up sewing to contribute to the family's savings, even though Tom disapproves. Her changed behavior makes her mother proud and more affectionate towards her. Maggie sits by the window when Mr. Wakem arrives with Philip. Philip waves at her. Maggie quickly leaves to avoid an awkward meeting in front of their fathers. She knows they can't be friends anymore, but she still feels grateful and sorry for Philip, remembering their childhood bond. At the same time, she wonders if he has changed. A few days later, Maggie meets Philip unexpectedly at the Red Deep's, her favorite place. They walk together, talking about their childhood and how things have changed. Philip shows her a portrait he painted of her as a child. He wishes they could stay friends, but Maggie says they can't. She has to let go of the things she once loved. Philip disagrees, saying it's wrong to sacrifice to please others. Torn between her duty and feelings for Philip, Maggie hesitates but finally agrees to meet him again. They have a bittersweet conversation. Philip wants to keep hoping for happiness, while Maggie feels she must accept her difficult life. Despite their differences, they part with strong connection. Maggie struggles with her decision to see Philip again, while Philip holds on to the hope that their friendship could become something more. Tom faces real-life challenges and works hard. His determination impresses his Uncle Dion, who sees potential in Tom for business. Tom's salary increases, but he stays focused on saving money. He gives up personal pleasures and avoids socializing, putting his family first. His dedication to hard work and self-discipline makes his uncle and aunt proud, especially Uncle Glegg, who sees Tom as responsible and capable. One day, Tom's old friend Bob Jakin suggests an idea to invest in sending goods to foreign markets. Although Tom's father is afraid of losing money, Tom turns to Uncle Glegg for financial support. With his help, Tom invests in the business, hoping to pay off his father's debts more quickly. Maggie feels torn after seeing Philip. She questions whether it's right to end their friendship just because others don't approve. but deep down she knows that keeping their meetings a secret would make her life difficult and cause problems. When they meet again, Maggie tells Philip they need to stop seeing each other. Philip pleads with her not to end the friendship, but Maggie says it's the right thing to do. Before they part, Philip suggests that meeting by chance in the future wouldn't be wrong. Maggie feels a sense of relief and agrees. But they continue to meet. Eventually, Philip tells Maggie that he loves her. At first, Maggie is uncertain, but later she admits she has strong feelings for him too. They share a sweet moment, and Maggie kisses Philip, promising to always care about him. However, she insists that they can only be friends. Maggie feels nervous that her father or Tom would find out about their meeting. But it's actually Aunt Pullet who mentions seeing Philip near the Red Deeps. This makes Tom suspicious. He confronts Maggie and forces her to choose between stopping her meetings with Philip or having him tell their father. Together, they meet with Philip one last time. Philip leaves the decision to Maggie, and sadly, she tells him they have to part. 3 weeks later, Tom Tulliver comes home early, feeling happy. After tea, he asks his father about the money saved in the tin box. Mr. Tulliver says it's only £193, but Tom asks him to count it again. Mr. Tulliver counts, and it is indeed £193. Then Tom surprises everyone by revealing that he has saved £320 through trading, which is enough to pay off the remaining debts. His mother hugs him, and his father is overwhelmed with emotion, bursting into tears. Tom assures his father that he will be able to pay the debts himself. Mr. Tulliver dreams of getting the mill back one day and feels proud to have a son like Tom. Tom enjoys this proud moment, and even Maggie, despite her own troubles, admires her brother. That night, Mr. Tulliver can't sleep, excited about being free from debt, but he is also troubled by dreams of revenge against Wakeham. The excitement from recent events affects Mr. Tulliver's health. The next day, at a meeting with his creditors, he feels proud and confident again, like his old self. He gives a speech explaining how he has paid off his debts with Tom's help. After the meeting, Mr. Tulliver rides home feeling victorious. He sees Wakeham near the mill, and a confrontation starts. In his anger, Mr. Tulliver knocks Wakeham off his horse and attacks him. Maggie arrives just in time to stop her father. Wakeham, injured, leaves and threatens legal action. Back inside, Mr. Tulliver feels unwell and collapses. His condition worsens through the night. In the early morning, Tom and Maggie are called to his bedside. Knowing he is dying, Mr. Tulliver makes Tom promise to care for the family and recover the mill. He refuses to forgive Wakeham, even in his final moments. He passes away, leaving Tom and Maggie by his empty chair. They seek comfort in each other and promise to stay united. 2 years go by. Mrs. Diane has passed away, and Mrs. Tulliver, who came to care for her sister during her illness, is now living with the Dianes. Lucy Diane is now 18 and engaged to Stephen Guest and heir to Guest and Company. Although Stephen hasn't formally proposed, he sees Lucy as the ideal wife, sweet and gentle. Lucy tells Stephen that her cousin Maggie is coming to visit. Maggie is leaving her teaching job and will stay for a month or two. They discuss Maggie's hard past and her family's struggles. After her father's death, Maggie chose not to live with her aunt Mrs. Pullet or depend on her brother Tom. Instead, she became a teacher. Philip is a friend of Stephen and Lucy, and they often spend time together. However, Lucy asks Stephen to tell Philip to stay away for now, as she wants to avoid any awkward encounter. She also wants to check with Maggie to see if she is comfortable seeing Philip. When Maggie arrives, Lucy tells her that she is deeply in love with Stephen and expects him to propose soon. Lucy also mentions that Philip Wakeham sometimes comes to sing with them. Maggie reassures Lucy that she has always liked Philip and doesn't mind seeing him. When Stephen arrives, he is surprised by Maggie's dark hair and intelligence. After chatting for a bit, Stephen takes Lucy and Maggie on a boat ride. While Maggie is getting her bonnet, Lucy tells Stephen that Maggie is fine with seeing Philip. During the boat ride, Maggie avoids looking at Stephen. When they get out of the boat, Maggie slips and Stephen catches her. Maggie loves the touch. She has never experienced the feeling of being taken care of by someone before. When they reach home, Mr. and Mrs. Pullet are there. Aunt Pullet sees Maggie's shabby clothes and promises to give her some clothes of her own. That night Maggie goes to her room but isn't ready to sleep. She is full of emotions after listening to Stephen's singing, and his looks during the evening keep her mind busy. Lucy comes in and they talk. Lucy asks what Maggie thinks of Stephen. Maggie admits she doesn't dislike him. Lucy then says Philip Wakeham will visit soon. Maggie gets nervous and explains that she promised Tom not to talk to Philip without his permission. Lucy offers to talk to Tom, but Maggie says she'll do it herself. Maggie tells Lucy how she once had feelings for Philip, but because of the issues between their families, she knows they can't be together. Lucy listens with care and stays hopeful, thinking things might get better for Maggie. Maggie visits Tom at his lodgings during lunch, where he is staying with Bob Jagan. Bob tells Maggie that Tom seems troubled and lonely, even though he is doing well in life. Maggie asks Tom to release her from the promise not to see Philip Wakeham. Tom reminds her of how he feels about Philip. Maggie explains that she only wants to see Philip because Lucy invited him. She no longer thinks of him as a romantic interest. She promises Tom that she won't go against his wishes. Tom eventually softens and allows Maggie to see Philip, but advises her to be cautious. Tom talks with his uncle, Mr. Dian, about business. After discussing a project in Newcastle, Mr. Dian suggests giving Tom a share in the family business as a reward for his hard work. Tom is happy, but has another concern. He wants to honor his late father's wish to buy back Dorlcote Mill. He explains his strong connection to the mill and asks his uncle to consider buying it from Wakeham. Mr. Dian reminds Tom that Wakeham may not want to sell, but Tom mentions that the current manager is doing poorly, which might make Wakeham more likely to sell. Mr. Dian agrees to think about it and says that he will revisit the idea when Tom returns from Newcastle. Maggie joins high society in St. Ogg's and quickly gains attention. Many young men admire her, and she enjoys the change in her life with more leisure, music, and admiration. Stephen Guest becomes more attracted to her, even though both he and Maggie try to avoid being alone together. Still, they get increasingly aware of each other. One evening, Stephen unexpectedly visits Maggie while Lucy is away, bringing music for her. They take a short, silent walk in the garden. Stephen offers Maggie his arm and they walk without talking. Confused by her own feelings, Maggie rushes back inside, where she cries, longing for the calm she feels with Philip. Meanwhile, Stephen wonders why he can't stop thinking about Maggie, even though he is engaged to Lucy. He promises to control his feelings from now on. The next morning, Philip visits the Dians. This meeting is emotional for both Maggie and Philip. Philip tries to stay calm and Maggie struggles to hide her feelings. Lucy tries to make things easier, leaving the room. Maggie tells Philip she asked Tom to let her see him again, and Tom agreed. Philip feels relieved that they can still be friends. Philip hints at deeper feelings, but Maggie remains focused on staying independent. Before they can talk anymore, Stephen arrives. Both Maggie and Stephen find it hard to manage their feelings for each other. Philip notices the subtle connection between them and feels uneasy. After a music session, Stephen leaves, but Philip stays longer, trying to understand what is happening between Maggie and Stephen. During lunch, Mr. Dian asks Philip about his father's properties. Later, Lucy finds out from her father about Tom's wish to buy back Dorlcote Mill from Wakeham. She wants to influence Philip to help. Mr. Dian isn't sure, but he allows her to try. Lucy talks to Philip about Tom's wish to buy back Dorlcote Mill. Philip spends a sleepless day and night thinking about it. He decides to talk to his father, Wakeham, and tries to convince him to sell the mill. Philip honestly shares his feelings for Maggie, saying he has loved her for years. Wakeham is angry at first, reminding Philip of the old conflict between their families, but eventually calms down. Philip admits he is unsure if Maggie still feels the same about him after their time apart. He asks his father to agree to sell the mill, hoping it will remove one of the obstacles between him and Maggie. Wakeham agrees, but refuses to deal with Tom directly. Feeling more confident, Philip goes to Mr. Dean to start the process of buying the mill. Lucy is happy that her plan to help the Tullivers might work. At the bazaar, Maggie stands out in her white dress, attracting many men to her stall. She sells mittens and hats she made. Mr. Wakeham visits her booth and buys some items from her. Later in the day, Stephen visits Maggie's stall. Philip Wakeham, watching from afar, senses tension between Maggie and Stephen and suspects there might be a deeper connection between them. After the bazaar, Philip confronts Stephen, calling him a hypocrite. Both men leave angrily, leaving Maggie feeling miserable about the conflict. However, Maggie resolves to escape this conflicted situation. She tells Lucy that she has accepted a teaching job and plans to leave. She explains that although she loves Philip, she cannot marry him because of Tom's objections. Lucy is shocked and upset. She tries to persuade Maggie to stay, but Maggie remains firm in her decision. Lucy, still hopeful, asks Maggie to come to the Park House dance before she leaves. At Park House, Lucy, dressed in white, stands out and gets all the attention. Maggie, in a simple black dress, at first refuses to dance, but eventually joins in and starts having fun. Stephen keeps his distance from Maggie the whole evening. However, when she starts dancing, he comes over and makes a suggestion that they take a walk. They go into the greenhouse and the mood becomes serious. Stephen, acting on impulse, kisses Maggie's arm. Maggie gets angry and Stephen quickly apologizes. Maggie tells him to stay away from her in the future. They both return to the dance. Maggie feels relieved for resisting further temptation. The next morning, as Maggie is getting ready to leave, Philip arrives. He asks her if there is any chance for them to be together, but Maggie explains that her loyalty to her brother Tom is too strong. Philip is saddened but accepts her decision. They sit quietly, holding hands, thinking about their past. Maggie has been staying with her Aunt Moss for 4 days. One afternoon, Stephen Guest arrives on a horse and asks Maggie to walk with him to talk privately. He tells Maggie he loves her and can't stop thinking about her. Maggie tries to stop him, but Stephen keeps begging, saying they should be together if they love each other. Maggie refuses, saying it's wrong to hurt others just to be happy. In the end, Stephen asks for just one kiss. Maggie hesitantly agrees. Afterward, feeling guilty and sad, Maggie rushes back to her aunt's house. Once there, she breaks down in tears. She tells her Aunt Moss how hard life has become. She wishes things were as simple as they were when she was younger. Maggie leaves her Aunt Moss after a week and goes to visit her Aunt Pullet. While she is there, Lucy arrives with good news. She tells Maggie that Tom might soon get the mill back because the man Wakeham hired had an accident and can't run it anymore. Lucy hopes this will make the family happy. She begins planning how to help Aunt Tulliver move back into the mill. Lucy also convinces Aunt Pullet to give Tom some household items to help him start fresh. Later, at a family gathering, Lucy talks to Tom about how Philip Wakeham helped him get the mill back. She hopes this will make Tom change his mind about Philip and accept Philip and Maggie's relationship. But Tom remains firm. He refuses to allow Maggie to marry Philip. Maggie returns to St. Ogg's within a week. During the day, she visits her aunt and spends time with her mother, helping prepare for Tom's new home. In the evenings, she joins Lucy in her dinner. Stephen also attends dinners at Diane's. They continue to exchange secret glances, unable to completely move on from their feelings. One evening, Lucy arranges a boating trip for Maggie, Stephen, and Philip. But when Philip falls ill and cannot come, Lucy's plan to leave Maggie alone with Philip backfires. Maggie ends up alone with Stephen on the boat instead. During the boat ride, they drift farther than they intended. Stephen suggests they never return and asks Maggie to marry him to escape their complicated lives. For a moment, Maggie is swayed by his words, but she manages to resist. As they continue on the boat, the emotions between them grow stronger. Eventually, they board a passing ship. Stephen whispers words of love to Maggie and about their future together. Maggie goes to sleep on deck with Stephen watching over her. When Maggie falls asleep, Stephen feels restless and walks around the deck, thinking about their future. Eventually, he lies down near her and sleeps. Maggie wakes up early, filled with guilt. She realizes the harm she has caused to those who trusted her, especially Lucy and Philip. She decides she must leave Stephen. Stephen begs her to stay, saying it's too late to change things. But Maggie insists they must part, even though it will hurt them both. She can't stand the thought of hurting Lucy and Philip any further. After a difficult conversation, Maggie leaves Stephen. She gets on a stagecoach, not knowing where it will take her. The coach takes her to York, further from her home. She rents a room at an inn and plans to return home the next day. 5 days go by, and Tom is now in charge of the family home. Despite his success, he is unhappy, worrying about Maggie. He fears she has brought shame to the family after hearing she was seen with Stephen. When Maggie arrives, Tom becomes angry. Maggie, feeling guilty, tries to explain, but Tom harshly rejects her. He says she has disgraced them and cannot stay with them. Mrs. Tulliver steps in. She comforts Maggie and insists that she stay with her. Feeling lost, Maggie suggests they go to Bob Jakin's house. Bob welcomes them and offers a place to stay. Maggie finds some comfort in Bob's kindness, but her guilt over her choices remains heavy. When Maggie returns, rumors spread, and people's opinion of her gets worse. If she had married Stephen, they might have forgiven her, but since she came back unmarried, they gossip that she acted recklessly and selfishly. Maggie feels worried about Stephen, Lucy and Philip. Lucy has been in bed since hearing the news, and no one knows anything about Philip. Maggie feels the weight of the pain she has caused to everybody and carries a deep sense of guilt. She doesn't focus on the rumors or what people say about her. Instead, she concentrates on trying to make things right. Maggie decides to stay in St. Aug's and live on her own, possibly by doing sewing work. She hopes to find a job and convince her mother to live with Tom again. Dr. Ken suggests that she should take a job far away, but Maggie is determined to stay and prove herself. Aunt Glegg's reaction is surprising. At first, she thought Maggie had drowned because she couldn't believe her niece would disgrace the family. But after hearing Maggie's explanation, she scolds Tom for judging Maggie too harshly without knowing the full truth. Aunt Glegg believes family should support each other as long as there is any honor left. Even though Maggie made mistakes, Aunt Glegg thinks it's important to protect her from outside criticism until everything is clear. Tom, however, sticks to his harsh judgment, convinced that Maggie's actions over the years prove she can't be trusted. Aunt Glegg agrees that Maggie should be punished, but only for what is proven, not based on the rumors. She offers Maggie a place to stay, but Maggie, feeling unable to face people, insists on living and working independently. Maggie then receives a letter from Philip. He tells her he saw what was happening between her and Stephen, but knows she tried her best to resist for his sake. Philip reassures her that she should not feel guilty because of him and offers to help her in any way he can. After reading the letter, Maggie becomes certain that no love could make her forget the pain she caused others. Dr. Ken offers Maggie a job as a governess for his children, and she gratefully accepts. The work gives her both a sense of purpose and independence. Maggie no longer needs her mother's support, so she encourages her to go back to the mill. However, rumors begin to spread in town about Dr. Ken and Maggie. Some people even suggest that he might marry her, which adds to the gossip. At the same time, Maggie wants Lucy's forgiveness, but she knows seeing her might only make things worse. When Maggie hears that Lucy is leaving town, she feels even more alone. One evening, Lucy secretly visits Maggie. They hug and exchange emotional words. Maggie shares her regret and promises never to hurt Lucy again. Lucy forgives her and promises to visit when she feels stronger. Days go by and it's now September. Late at night, a heavy rainstorm beats against Maggie's window. The weather has changed, causing floods along the river. But Maggie doesn't realize the danger outside. She is troubled after receiving a letter from Stephen. He begs her to come back to him and blames her for their separation. For hours, Maggie struggles with whether to respond. In the end, she chooses to burn the letter. As she wrestles with her emotions, water starts flooding her room. Realizing the house is in danger, she wakes up Bob Jakin and helps with his boats. Suddenly, the water rises quickly and Maggie's boat is swept far down the river. Alone and worried about her family, she rows toward the mill, hoping to find her brother Tom and their mother. When she reaches the mill, she finds Tom alone and they quickly get into the boat. Together, they head out to check on Lucy, fearing she might be in danger. As they row down the flooded river, they are struck by large floating debris. In their final moments, Tom holds Maggie close. In their final moments, Tom holds Maggie close, and they are swept away by the current. They drown together, embracing each other. 5 years later, St. Ogg's looks much like it did before the flood. Dorlcote Mill is rebuilt, and the churchyard, once disturbed by the flood, is peaceful again. Near their father's grave, a tomb was built for Tom and Maggie. Stephen and Lucy visit Maggie's grave together, while Philip comes to visit alone. The tomb has the words, "In their death they were not divided." Sad, isn't it? How do you feel about Tom, Maggie, and their story that you have heard today? Do let us know in the comment section. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Good night.